The church was packed for my father's funeral. Daniel Carter had been a pillar of the community, building Carter Enterprises from a small residential contractor to the largest commercial developer in 3 states. Everyone who mattered was there: business associates, politicians, family, friends, all paying their respects to a man who had built an empire worth over $75 million from nothing. I stood quietly near the casket, accepting condolences with my sister, Emily. We had both dropped everything to come home when Dad had his heart attack, but we'd arrived too late to say goodbye. Emily had flown in from her surgical residency in Boston, while I'd left my architectural firm in New York. We'd always been close, united by our shared grief after Mom died when we were teenagers and now at the loss of our father. "How are you holding up, Sarah?" Emily whispered as another group of mourners moved past. "I'm managing," I replied, though the truth was I felt numb. Dad and I had always been close. As the daughter who followed him into the construction industry, albeit as an architect rather than a developer, we shared a special bond. Emily squeezed my hand as our cousin Andrew approached, his wife, Claire, at his side. Andrew was Uncle Richard's son, and he'd been working at Carter Enterprises since college. While Emily and I had pursued our own paths, Andrew had positioned himself as Dad's right hand and apparent successor. Sarah, Emily, Andrew embraced us with practiced sympathy. "Your father was like a second father to me. This is devastating for all of us." There was something performative about his grief that set my teeth on edge, but I pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't the time. "Thank you for handling the arrangements," I said. Dad had suffered his heart attack at the office, and Andrew had taken charge of everything while Emily and I were traveling home. "Of course," Andrew nodded solemnly. Daniel would have expected nothing less. In fact, he'd been preparing me to take over more responsibilities. We'd been discussing my eventually taking the CEO position. I blinked in surprise. This was the first I'd heard of any succession plan favoring Andrew. Dad had always been tight-lipped about his business decisions, but this seemed like something he would have mentioned. "I'm sure we'll all have time to discuss the company after we've had a chance to grieve," Emily interjected smoothly, ever the diplomat. Andrew's expression hardened slightly. "Actually, there are some matters that can't wait. I've scheduled a family meeting at the house after the reception. The lawyers will be there." After the burial, mourners gathered at my father's sprawling Victorian home on Lakeview Drive. The house where Emily and I had grown up was now filled with visitors eating catered food and sharing stories about Dad. I moved through the rooms in a daze, accepting condolences and trying to process that he was really gone. "Sarah," a familiar voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see David Miller, Dad's longtime friend and the architect who had first inspired my career choice. "David, thank you for coming." We embraced, and I felt tears threatening again. David had been a fixture in our lives, almost family. "Daniel was so proud of you," he said, his voice gentle. "He told everyone about your New York firm and the awards you've won." I smiled through my tears. We were working on a project together, actually, a community center downtown. Dad was providing the land and financing, and I was designing it. David looked surprised. I hadn't heard about that. We were keeping it quiet until the plans were finalized. Dad wanted it to be his legacy project: affordable housing, community spaces, a medical clinic. We were going to break ground next spring. Before David could respond, Andrew appeared, announcing that the family meeting would begin in Dad's study. I excused myself and made my way through the house, finding Emily already seated in one of the leather chairs facing Dad's massive oak desk. Andrew had positioned himself in Dad's chair, with Claire standing beside him. 2 men in suits, lawyers presumably, stood nearby. "Now that we're all here," Andrew began once I'd taken a seat, "we can address some urgent matters. As you know, Daniel was the sole owner of Carter Enterprises and all its subsidiaries. With his unexpected passing, there are decisions that need to be made immediately to ensure business continuity." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "I'm Thomas Harris, corporate counsel for Carter Enterprises. In the absence of a formally executed will—" "Wait," I interrupted. "What do you mean, absence of a will?" Dad definitely had a will. He updated it every few years. Andrew cleared his throat. "Unfortunately, there was an accident last week. Daniel had his estate documents out for review, and there was a fire in a fireplace. A draft caught some papers. The will was destroyed." I stared at him in disbelief. And there were no copies with the lawyers or anywhere else. Your father preferred to keep his personal affairs private, Harris explained. He kept the original in his home safe. We were scheduled to review it this coming week, but Emily leaned forward. This doesn't make sense. Dad was meticulous about everything, especially legal matters. Grief can be disorienting, Andrew said with practiced sympathy. The important thing now is to establish interim leadership for the company. As the senior executive and Daniel's closest male relative, I'm prepared to step in as acting CEO until more permanent arrangements can be made. The second lawyer distributed folders. We've prepared these interim management agreements. Essentially, they authorize Andrew to manage all Carter family assets and business interests while the estate is settled. Without a will, this process could take some time. I opened the folder and skimmed the document, my suspicion growing with every paragraph. The agreement would effectively give Andrew complete control over Dad's entire estate, the company, properties, investments, everything. And if we don't sign? Emily asked, always direct. Andrew's smile tightened. Without clear authority, the company could face operational paralysis. Projects would stall, contracts could be jeopardized, and the value of the estate, your inheritance, could be significantly diminished. I closed the folder. We need time to review this with our own lawyers. Of course, Andrew nodded magnanimously, but I should mention that there are several major deals in progress that require immediate attention. Any delay could be costly. We'll have our answer tomorrow, I said firmly. For now, I think we've had enough business talk for a funeral day. As the meeting broke up, I caught Harris giving Andrew a subtle nod. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find out what before signing anything. That evening, after most of the mourners had left, Emily and I sat in the kitchen of our childhood home, trying to make sense of the day's events. There's no way Dad's will just happen to burn up right before he died, Emily said, expressing exactly what I'd been thinking. And there's no way he didn't have copies, I added. Andrew is lying. Emily rubbed her temples. But why? Dad treated Andrew like a son. He was already going to inherit something substantial. I thought about Andrew's ambition, how he'd always wanted to be seen as Dad's successor. Maybe substantial wasn't enough. Maybe he wanted everything. Everything. What do? We can't prove anything, and without the will. I stood up suddenly, remembering something important. Dad took me to his bank last month. He showed me his safe deposit box and made sure I knew how to access it. He said it was just in case. Emily's eyes widened. Do you think? I don't know, but it's worth checking. The bank opens at 9 o'clock tomorrow. The next morning, we'd arrived at First National Bank as soon as it opened. The manager, recognizing us as Daniel Carter's daughters, expressed his condolences before escorting us to the vault area. Your father was one of our most valued clients, he explained as he located the correct box. He maintained several accounts and the safe deposit box for over 30 years. He used his key, and I used the key Dad had given me. The box slid out, and my heart raced as the manager discreetly left us alone with its contents. Inside were several sealed envelopes, a USB drive, and a leather portfolio. The large envelope was labeled Last Will and Testament, copy. I knew what Emily whispered as I opened the envelope. The will was comprehensive and crystal clear. Dad had left 30% of Carter Enterprises to me, 30% to Emily, 20% to Andrew, and 10% to a charitable foundation he'd established in Mom's name. He named me as CEO, citing my architectural vision and business acumen, with provisions for Emily to remain on the board despite her medical career. But that wasn't all. The leather portfolio contained detailed plans for the community center project I'd mentioned to David, complete with funding allocations, land deeds, and architectural renderings I created. Dad had already transferred the downtown property and $25 million in development funds to a separate LLC that was jointly owned by him and me. The USB drive contained years of company records, including evidence that Andrew had been systematically diverting company resources to side projects that benefited him personally, not enough to be immediately noticeable, but substantial over time. He didn't just want to control the company, I realized aloud. He needed to cover up what he'd been doing. Emily squeezed my hand. What's our next move? I thought of Andrew sitting in Dad's chair, so confident in his scheme. We go to the meeting he's arranged and bring some guests of our own. That afternoon, Andrew greeted us with barely concealed impatience as we entered Dad's study. He had the signed management agreements laid out on the desk, pens at the ready. "Have you made your decision?" he asked. "As I mentioned, we have pressing matters requiring immediate attention." "We have," I replied calmly. "But before we sign anything, we'd like to introduce some people." On cue, the study door opened. David Miller entered, followed by an elegant older woman I knew was Dad's personal attorney, Margaret Hayes. Behind them came two members of the Carter Enterprises Board of Directors. Andrew's expression flickered between confusion and alarm. "What is this?" "This," I said, placing Dad's will on the desk, "is a copy of our father's actual will. The one you knew existed because he reviewed it with all his senior executives last year." Color draining from Andrew's face. "Where did you?" "Dad kept copies in his safe deposit box," Emily explained, "along with some very interesting company records." Margaret Hayes stepped forward. "As Daniel Carter's personal attorney, I can confirm this is his most recent will, properly executed and witnessed. I hold the official copy in my firm's records." Andrew's corporate lawyer, Harris, looked stunned. "I was told there was no will, that everything had been destroyed in an accident." "There was no accident," I said, my voice steady despite my anger. "Andrew lied to you, to us, and planned to seize control of everything our father built." "These are serious accusations," Andrew blustered, but his confidence was visibly crumbling. "I was only trying to ensure business continuity during a difficult time by presenting false documents and attempting to defraud the rightful heirs." Margaret asked sharply. "That's not continuity, that's criminal." One of the board members, Janet Foster, spoke up. "The board will need to address this immediately. Andrew's actions represent a serious breach of fiduciary duty." Andrew looked desperately around the room, finding no allies. "This is a misunderstanding. I was only acting in the family's best interests." "And the funds you diverted to Pinnacle Ventures?" I asked, referencing information from the USB drive. "Was that in the family's best interest too?" His face went completely white. "How did you?" "Dad knew," Emily said quietly. "He was gathering evidence. That's probably why he made sure we could access the safe deposit box." For the next hour, the true extent of Andrew's betrayal unfolded. He'd not only planned to hijack the entire company but had been embezzling funds for years. Dad had suspected but had been gathering concrete proof before confronting him. As the meeting concluded, Andrew and Claire were escorted from the property by security. The board members called an emergency session, and Margaret began the formal process of executing Dad's will. Left alone in the study with Emily, I finally let my guard down. "I can't believe he would do this. Dad trusted him." Emily put her arm around me. "Dad also protected against it. He made sure we had what we needed to expose the truth." I nodded, glancing around the study that held so many memories. My eyes fell on the architectural plans for the community center, Dad's legacy project, now my responsibility to complete. "What will you do about the CEO position?" Emily asked. "Dad named you in the will, but you have your own firm in New York." I traced my fingers over the community center designs. "I think it's time to come home. Dad built something important here. He trusted me to carry it forward." 1 month later, I stood on the vacant downtown lot where the Carter Community Center would soon rise. Construction equipment was already in place for the groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for the following day. The project had expanded to include not just affordable housing and a medical clinic, but also an educational center for construction and architectural training for underprivileged youth. Andrew had been removed from the company and was facing criminal charges for embezzlement. He and Claire had left town, their carefully crafted social standing in ruins. Emily had returned to Boston but planned to split her time between her medical career and her board responsibilities. We discovered that Dad had been quietly funding a medical research initiative in Mom's name at Emily's hospital, another piece of his legacy neither of us had known about. As the sun began to set over the city skyline, I felt a sense of peace washing over me. Dad had prepared us better than we'd ever known, not just with assets and legal protections, but with the values and skills to continue what he'd started. "We're ready for tomorrow's ceremony, Miss Carter," my project manager called from across the lot. "Thank you, Mark," I replied, taking one last look at the empty space that would soon transform into Dad's final gift to the community. In my pocket was the key to Dad's safe deposit box. A reminder that sometimes the most important inheritances aren't just what's visible to others, but the foresight, wisdom, and love that remain long after someone is gone. Andrew had been so focused on controlling the company that he completely missed the true wealth Dad had built, not just in assets, but in relationships, respect, and vision for the future. While my cousin had schemed for what he could take, Dad had been quietly planning what he could give. Standing there on the threshold of that future, I silently thanked my father for his final lesson. True legacy isn't measured in dollars or property deeds, but in the positive change we create and the wisdom we pass on. Andrew had tried to steal an inheritance, but he could never touch the real wealth Dad had left us, the opportunity to continue making a difference in the world he loved.